Dear students, wish you all a happy day. I welcome you all for today's session on American poems. I am Dr.Anitha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Nirmala College for Women, Coimbatore. Let me introduce the poet. Emily Dickinson was a major American English literature poet of the 19th century. Her works concentrated on the subject of death, and her themes strongly speaks about the inner conflicts of mind. With this introduction, let us now move on to the video.
Analysis of Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Emily Dickinson stands today in the front rank of American poets. She lived a life outwardly uninteresting, inwardly devoted to a secret, and indulged in a self-imposed assignment of writing poems. Emily Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830, in New England, where Puritanism was dying and literature was just coming to life. Her birthplace was Amherst, a quiet village in the Connecticut Valley of Massachusetts. To speak about 19th century American poetry, it had been represented by the three great poets, namely Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Emily Dickinson. To this century belongs Emily Dickinson, who is considered as greatest of all American women poets. She did not write art for art's sake, but rather for herself, which delineates her experiences, her thoughts, and most of all, the problems faced by the poet. To speak about the source of Dickinson's poetry, she has borrowed from the ordinary life at Amherst of her time. She was much influenced by her father. Moreover, the loss of her near and dear ones and the ordinary things. Let us now have a quick look at her themes, which reveals preoccupation with the reality of God, the possibility of a faith, the effect of death, the problems of immortality, the nature of soul, love, passion, pain, social scene, and nature. Emily is often referred to as the myth of Amherst and later as the Nun of Amherst. After her death and successive fame, she became the Belle of Amherst. Emily Dickinson's poetry. Emily wrote about 1,800 poems, only 7 of which were published during her lifetime. 5 of them in the Springfield Republican. First edition of her poetry was published in 1890, edited by Mabel Loomis Todd and Thomas W. Higginson. The complete edition of her poems was published in 3 volumes by Thomas H. Johnson in the year 1955. The recurring themes in her poetry are death, immortality, love, and nature. Various other subjects of her poetry are nature, love, death, frustration, pain and suffering, immortality, God and Christ. Though Emily Dickinson wrote poems on nature, her indomitable expression is more about death. Considering the theme of death in Emily Dickinson's poetry is not an ordinary theme but an outcome of her preoccupation with frustration, pain, suffering, sorrow, grief, loneliness, which is relevant in the poem Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And so, being obsessed with the problems of death, she personified death as a patient gentleman, courtly lover, and so on. The very first lines of the poem, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. This line expresses that human does not have options to choose when they die. Here, the speaker is leading a busy life, unable to stop for death. Instead, death arrives to her home to take the speaker. Moreover, death here is symbolized as a comforting and polite man. Understanding the theme of the poem, I am going to draw your attention to the poetic technique of Emily Dickinson. The poetry of Emily Dickinson impresses the reader for its freshness, vigor, and vitality, because it is not merely reflections of our experiences and situations, expressed with unique style, imagery, and also accompanied with humor with pure lyric poetry. Moreover, Emily created her own technique, rejecting the traditional forms and experimenting with grammar, meters, capitals, rhyme schemes, and punctuation. Let us see how Emily Dickinson personified death. Death does not bring fear, anguish, tension, and trauma in her mind, but it is a consolation and her apprehension to accept death in order to end up this gruesome life and enter the state of immortality where you need not worry about the physical world. Let me take your attention to the analysis of the poem, where death is personified throughout as a metaphor to convey what death is truly like. First, let us have a look at the characters. We have 4 characters, namely speaker, death, immortality, and children.
The speaker is a woman who speaks from the grave.
She says she calmly accepted. In fact, she seemed to welcome death as a suitor whom she planned to marry. The second character is death, suitor who called for the narrator to escort her to eternity. The third character is immortality, a passenger in the carriage. And the fourth, children, boys and girls at play in the schoolyard. They symbolized children as a stage of life. To delineate the expression of a unique style, I am going to speak on the poetic devices applied by the poet. The entire poem contains imagery to create the scene of the speaker traveling with death to the grave. Let us now study about repetition or anaphora, which means repeating frequent of words for emphasis, where we could see in the lines from 1 to 12. The phrase "we passed" appears 3 times in 3 stanzas. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. The next poetic device which has been used by the poet is alliteration, which means the occurrence of the same letter or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. Recess, ring, grazing, grain, setting, sun, gossamer, gown, tippet, tulle, horses, heads. Next is metaphor. Figure of speech in which a word or phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. Example, the character of death is used as an extended metaphor to examine what real death may be like. The house is a metaphor for a grave. Next is personification. Here, death is personified and is a guide leading the speaker to eternity. Here we have, he kindly stopped for me. He knew no haste. His civility, we paused before a house. The dews grew quivering chill. Next is punctuation and capitalization. Capitalized words brings the reader's attention to the word and shows its importance. Uses a lot of dashes to emphasize a longer pause. References to religion reflects the religious values. He, God, and immortality believe that life after death is eternal in heaven. Next is diction. Dickinson uses a simple writing style that emphasizes the speaker's acceptance with death, kindly, and civility, conveys to readers that death is the speaker's friend and the speaker accepts dying. Death slowly drove, he knew no haste. So, readers can infer that death is slow and takes its time. The grave is not something to be feared. This is shown by her by describing the grave simply as a house. Next is tone, light-hearted and accepting. Although death is usual, a sad event, Dickinson makes it seem like a good thing because the speaker does not fear it. Uses words like kindly, civility, solemn. Death is a serious subject, but the speaker understands now that it is just a part of life. Uses phrases such as he knew no haste, shock. Death came for the speaker in the middle of a busy life, when she was not prepared, because I could not stop for death. To conclude on the analysis of Emily Dickinson's poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, propounds a genuine expression of our inner feelings of death, which is part of everybody's life, to be embraced as death will not stop for no one.
We have come to the end of the session. Hope it was informative. Thank you.